They mocked his reload trick until he stopped 40 Japanese in 36 minutes and saved 190 lives. The rain had been falling since before dawn, soaking the ground until every step sank in a thick mud. The air was heavy with moisture and smelled of wet bark, rotting leaves, and burnt powder from firefights that had taken place earlier in the week. Visibility shifted every few seconds as clouds of mist drifted over the ridge. The Marines of the 1st Division were spread thin across a defensive line carved out between fallen palm trees and shallow trenches. It was not a planned position. It was simply where the terrain allowed them to stop and catch their breath after days of pushing through New Britain's dense jungle. Private Daniel Rourke knelt behind a cracked palm trunk, adjusting the wet sling on his M1 Garand. He was 24, from rural Oregon, a quiet man who rarely spoke unless necessary. Before the war, he had worked long days on a small family farm, fixing machinery, moving equipment, and developing fast, precise habits that came from repetition and necessity. His squad mates called him focused, maybe too serious at times, but dependable. He had no combat decorations, no special status, nothing that marked him as different. But he had one unusual skill, a fast reload technique he had practiced on every spare moment since training, a habit others joked about without understanding why he did it. For Rourke, it was routine, something he could control in a place where almost nothing could be controlled. Next to him, Corporal Thomas Hale wiped water from his eyes with the back of his hand. Hale was 28, older than most of the squad, formerly a dock worker from Baltimore who had joined the Marines after his younger brother enlisted in the Army. Hale had a calm presence that steadied the younger men. He wasn't a fast talker or a storyteller, but when he gave an order, people listened. He and Rourke had fought together since landing on New Britain 2 weeks earlier, and Hale had learned to trust Rourke's instincts even when others didn't notice them. Their squad leader, Sergeant Jacob Mallory, crouched a few feet away, scanning the ridge through scratched field glasses. Mallory was 31, a former schoolteacher from Ohio who had been in the Marines since 1940. He had fought on Guadalcanal and carried himself like a man who understood the cost of underestimating the enemy. He was strict, but his men respected him because he never asked them to do something he wouldn't do himself. His job that morning was simple and difficult at the same time. Hold the left flank of the American perimeter while a patrol pushed forward toward a cluster of Japanese defensive positions the division was trying to clear. The terrain was narrow, visibility was poor, and the squad's task was to prevent any enemy movement from slipping behind the patrol's path. A radio operator behind them tried to maintain a stable signal, tapping the handset and adjusting the antenna. Humidity made transmission unreliable. Static came and went without warning. The Marines knew that if they were hit, they might not receive help quickly. Rourke's attention fixed on the jungle in front of him. The rain weakened slightly, reducing to a steady, heavy rhythm. Something felt off. He couldn't explain it at first, but the longer he listened, the more certain he became. The background noise had changed. Earlier, there had been insects, occasional bird calls, and the constant faint movement of small animals in the underbrush. Now there was nothing but the sound of rain. He leaned slightly toward Hale. "You hear that?" he said quietly. Hale listened, confused for a moment, and then his expression shifted when he realized what Rourke meant. It wasn't what they heard. It was what they didn't. Mallory noticed the two men exchanging looks. "Something wrong?" he asked. Rourke kept his eyes on the tree line. The jungle went silent. "Sergeant." Mallory lowered the field glasses and listened. The silence remained. A few seconds later, a single rifle shot cracked from the trees ahead, sharp and close. Another followed, then a short burst of automatic fire. The sound bounced through the clearing and across the ridges. "Positions!" Mallory snapped, dropping to one knee. "Contact front." The squad reacted instantly. Men pulled in closer to cover. Rifles came up. A bar gunner slid behind a stump and braced his weapon. The rain intensified for a moment, tapping against helmets as Marines flattened themselves into firing positions. Then the voices came, shouts, fast and harsh, rising over the sound of the rain. There was no confusion about what it was. A coordinated Japanese assault was coming straight toward them. Within seconds, figures appeared through the trees. Dozens of them, some advanced low to the ground, others upright, and pushing forward with speed. They moved through the vegetation as if they had rehearsed the route 100 times. Rifles, bayonets, and light machine guns glinted between leaves and rain streaks. Rourke steadied his breathing. His task at that moment was clear and simple. Hold the left flank and prevent any enemy from passing through the gap between their position and the ridge. If the Japanese broke through, they would hit the support personnel, drivers, mortar teams, and wounded men positioned behind the main line. Nearly 200 Americans depended on a thin group of riflemen at the flank holding their ground. Mallory shouted, "Hold this line! No one pulls back!" Hale echoed the command down the line. Rourke raised his rifle, locked his sight on the first silhouette moving through the rain, and waited for the moment he had trained for since he first touched a Garand. The jungle, the rain, and the approaching enemy seemed to close in at the same time. The battle for the flank had begun. Before the attack on the flank, long before the rain and the confusion of Cape Gloucester, Daniel Rourke had spent months preparing for a moment he never expected to come this way. He had enlisted in 1942 with no special ambitions other than to serve. His family's farm in Oregon ran on limited manpower, and he had grown up doing heavy work from sunrise to sunset. He was used to fixing broken machinery before it slowed down the day's tasks, and he had developed a habit of moving quickly and efficiently without thinking about it. When he began training with the Marine Corps, that instinct carried over. While learning to use the M1 Garand during rifle qualification, he discovered something unusual. The reload, something most recruits struggle with at first, felt natural to him. He practiced it repeatedly, not out of pride, but out of routine. He disassembled and reassembled the rifle until the motions became automatic. Then he focused on the reload specifically. How to angle the rifle to let gravity help, how to line his hand with the receiver so the clip slid in smoothly, how to close the bolt without catching his thumb, and how to move the rifle back to firing position without wasting time. During downtime in camp, others played cards, smoked, or talked about home. Rourke knelt by his bunk or beside a supply crate and practiced his sequence over and over. Hand to pouch, clip out, rotate the rifle slightly, insert, push down, close the bolt, lift and shoulder. He did this until his fingertips were raw and until he could complete the action without looking. Some men laughed at him for it. "Rourke's doing his circus trick again," one corporal from another squad once joked. "He thinks the Japs will wait politely for him to perform." Another chimed in, "Maybe he wants to be a magician after the war." Rourke pretended not to hear them. He didn't practice for attention. He practiced because repetition calmed him. It gave him a sense of control. The war was unpredictable, but the rifle in his hands behaved the same way every time he handled it. Only Sergeant Mallory saw the value in it early on. Mallory had been a schoolteacher before the war, and he had a habit of noticing quiet details in people. He watched Rourke work through his drill late one evening while most of the squad was resting. When Rourke finished, Mallory walked over and examined the rifle. "You're not trying to show off," Mallory said. "No, Sergeant," Rourke answered. "You're planning ahead." "I just want to be faster when I need to be," Rourke said. Mallory nodded. "People mock what they don't understand. Keep practicing." Those words stayed with Rourke. He didn't know if his speed mattered or if it ever would, but Mallory's approval made him continue refining the technique until it became second nature. Cape Gloucester changed everything. The island was a battlefield made of mud, rainfall, and constant tension. The Marines had fought through thick jungle, harsh weather, and persistent Japanese resistance since landing after Christmas. The enemy launched small, probing attacks at night. Snipers fired from concealed positions during the day, and every ridge felt like a trap waiting to spring. When Rourke's squad was assigned to protect the left flank of a patrol pushing inland, the task seemed straightforward. They were there to prevent enemy infiltration, to keep the perimeter secure while others moved forward. The ground favored the Japanese. Thick brush, limited visibility, and enough cover for an entire platoon to move silently if they knew the terrain. Rourke had spent the morning observing every inch of the tree line. He counted the seconds between sounds. He studied how the rain affected sightlines. He noted where the ground dipped and where a soldier could crouch unseen. Hale watched him do it and understood the value. Mallory encouraged it. They all knew the Japanese had a history of exploiting the smallest weakness. What none of them knew was how quickly the situation would escalate. Later, when the first rifle cracks tore across the clearing and the Japanese charge erupted through the trees, the jokes about Rourke's reload trick disappeared from his mind instantly. Only the muscle memory remained. The Garand slammed against his shoulder. The front sight settled on a moving silhouette. The rifle fired, and before the empty clip even hit the mud, Rourke's hands were already moving in the motion he had practiced thousands of times. Every fraction of a second mattered. Every mistake meant someone would die. Every hesitation widened the gap on the flank. As the first wave closed in, Rourke understood that the skill he had been mocked for was no longer a curiosity. It was the one advantage he had over the chaos unfolding in front of him. And the attack had only just begun. The first wave of Japanese riflemen broke through the curtain of palms with controlled speed, their movements synchronized and deliberate. They ran low to the ground, rifles held tight, boots striking the mud with practiced discipline. The rain blurred their shapes, but their direction was unmistakable. They were pushing directly toward the gap on the American left flank. It was the weakest part of the perimeter, the one angle the terrain left exposed. The Japanese force had found it within seconds. Rourke steadied himself behind the fallen palm trunk. His breath was controlled, his shoulder firm against the stock of the Garand. When the first soldier came into view at less than 70 yards, Rourke fired a single shot. The recoil pushed into his bruised shoulder, but he held his line. Hale fired beside him, working his Springfield with fast, practiced motions, the bolt sliding back and forth with a wet metallic snap. The bar gunner on their right opened up with a controlled burst, the weapon's rhythm cutting through the rain. "Shift left, keep the angle tight," Mallory called, raising his voice over the gunfire. Rounds cracked into tree trunks and snapped through ferns. The attackers did not hesitate. More Japanese soldiers emerged, some carrying grenades, some flanking toward tree clusters for cover, others pushing straight forward with bayonets fixed. Their officers shouted orders in sharp bursts, directing the men to spread out and cut the flank open before the Americans could reorganize. A mortar round landed behind the Marines' position, shaking the ground and knocking leaves down in heavy clumps. The radio operator shouted into his handset, but the interference drowned his voice. Reinforcements were too far away to respond quickly, and the Japanese were closing the distance with alarming speed. Rourke fired again. The Garand ejected its empty clip with a metallic ping that vanished under the noise of the battle. Without hesitating, he lowered the rifle slightly, angled the receiver, rolled the clip in with a precise snap of his hand, and drove the bolt forward. The entire movement took less than 2 seconds. Hale saw it, but had no time to comment. He just kept firing. The second wave advanced faster. They moved through the brush with a mix of discipline and urgency, men replacing the casualties instantly. The clearing offered little depth, and the Marines had barely 10 meters of ground before the perimeter collapsed behind them. They had to hold. Another burst of Japanese fire kicked up mud inches from Rourke's boots. A bullet struck the palm trunk he used as cover, splitting the wood and showering him with damp fragments. He ignored the sting on his cheek and fired again. One target dropped. Another pushed forward. Rourke reloaded and continued firing, the pattern becoming mechanical. Mallory crawled along the line, positioning men and shouting instructions. His voice was steady despite the chaos. "Keep spacing. Don't let them push between the stumps. Watch your right. They're splitting the group." To the right, one Marine shouted that he was out of ammunition. A second threw him a bandolier without looking up. The bar gunner's weapon began to steam from the rain, hitting the heated metal. He shifted positions to keep the barrel from sinking into mud. Rourke glanced across the clearing just long enough to see what he feared. The Japanese were adjusting, redirecting more men toward the exact gap their squad was defending. They understood the terrain. They understood the opportunity. If they broke through here, they could pour into the unprotected rear of the American line. Mallory signaled to hold the ground at all costs. Rourke fired until his rifle clicked empty again. The clip dropped into the mud, but his hand had already reached for the next one. His fingers moved by instinct. His eyes stayed locked on the advancing attackers. Even in the rain, even with the pressure, he did not fumble a single reload. A grenade landed 10 feet ahead. Hale yelled for cover. Rourke pressed against the trunk as the explosion sent mud and debris flying over them, the shockwave muffling the sound around him for a moment. When his hearing returned, the attackers were closer, far closer. Hale fired into the closest group, chambered another round, fired again. Mallory shot over a stump, ducked down, and moved to support the bar gunner. The Japanese pressure did not slow. Their officers pushed them forward with hand signals and short commands, urging the men to exploit the thinning American line. Rourke felt his pulse accelerate, but his hand stayed steady. He reloaded again, fired again. His shoulder tightened from repeated recoil, but he stayed on target. Each shot bought seconds. Seconds kept the line alive. As the firefight intensified, the air filled with the combined noise of rifles, distant mortars, shouted orders, and the steady impact of rain. The vegetation around them was shredded into damp fragments. The mud turned into deep ruts from shifting bodies and spent shells. Through all of it, Rourke kept moving with a rhythm that he could not have explained if asked. He was no longer thinking about the trick he had practiced. He was simply surviving, and survival required speed. The reload that had been a source of jokes was now the only reason he could keep up with the pace of the attack. The Japanese continued to press forward, and with each meter they gained, the pressure on the Marines increased. Rourke understood that if they fell back even a little, the entire left side of the perimeter would collapse. There was no room to retreat. Their task was absolute. Hold this ground, or the larger force behind them would be exposed. The enemy was adapting, pushing harder, and sending more men into the narrow space. Rourke knew this was only the beginning. The real test was still ahead, and the weight of the line was shifting onto him with every passing second. The attack did not come in one continuous surge, but in sharp, organized intervals, each one stronger than the last. After the first wave fell back into the trees, there was a brief pause, no more than 5 or 6 seconds, barely enough time for Rourke to breathe. He could hear Hale muttering under his breath as he worked the bolt of his Springfield. The bar gunner's weapon hissed as rain struck the heated barrel. Mallory shouted down the line, repositioning 2 men to cover a narrowing gap. The radio operator tried again to reach command, but the static drowned out every word. Then the second wave came. This time the attackers were closer, faster, and more aggressive. Several carried knee mortars. Others had grenades in their belts. They used the terrain efficiently, weaving between trees, advancing behind clusters of ferns, and laying down suppressive fire to force the Marines into cover. The sudden increase in pressure immediately strained the American position. Rourke fired until the rifle kicked empty. The bolt locked back. His hands moved instantly. He dropped the spent clip, reached for another, and slammed it in with a forceful push before snapping the bolt shut. The moment the rifle was ready, he fired again into a pair of advancing silhouettes. His shoulder ached, but he ignored the discomfort. His focus stayed on the approaching figures and the shifting gaps in the line. A Japanese soldier darted from behind a tree and hurled a grenade. It landed between 2 Marines on the right. One of them kicked it away just before it detonated, the blast sending mud and debris into the air. Both men were thrown backward but remained conscious. Mallory crawled toward them, shouting for them to shift left and tighten the line. The ground was becoming unsteady. Mud flowed around their knees. The rain intensified again, washing dirt across the clearing. Every movement felt heavier. The Marines had to drag themselves from one position to another, often sliding in the slick terrain. Rourke fired another shot and watched a soldier collapse into the ferns. More riflemen replaced him immediately. The attackers were not acting as a reckless crowd. They were rotating, repositioning, and keeping constant pressure on the flank. Their officers directed them from the rear, shouting commands that cut through the rain in rapid bursts. "Keep your fire consistent," Mallory yelled. "Don't let them push us back." Rourke reloaded again, another quick, precise motion, and scanned the left sector. On the far edge of the line, two Marines were struggling to hold off a smaller group of Japanese soldiers maneuvering wide. If those attackers slipped through, they would be behind the entire flank within seconds. Rourke shifted his angle and fired 3 controlled shots to relieve the pressure. Hale adjusted his own position to cover the center. The second wave reached within 30 yards before it finally broke. The surviving attackers pulled back, disappearing behind trees and large root systems. Another short pause followed, barely long enough for the Marines to check their ammunition. "How many you got left?" Hale asked, breathless. Rourke pulled at his pouches. 3 clips. Maybe 4. "Same here," Hale said. "We need resupply." Mallory overheard and shook his head. "Nobody's getting through this mud fast enough. We hold with what we've got." Then the third wave arrived. It began with coordinated rifle fire from the rear, forcing the Marines to keep their heads down. Through the heavy rain, Rourke saw soldiers advancing in a staggered line. This group moved with more discipline, likely the core of the Japanese platoon. They halted, fired, and advanced again in short bounds. The spacing between them made it harder to target more than one at a time. Rourke raised his rifle, fired, and reloaded as soon as the clip emptied. The rapid motion of snapping in a new clip was now a lifeline. His hands were wet and covered in mud, but they maintained the exact rhythm he had drilled into himself for months. He could not afford a single error. Any hesitation meant the attackers would close the gap. A bullet struck the palm trunk directly in front of him, splintering wood across his face. Another snap past his ear. Rourke kept firing. Hale worked his bolt-action rifle as quickly as possible, but he could not match the rate of fire needed to counter the advancing group. Rourke compensated, targeting the soldiers Hale could not. One attacker sprinted forward with a grenade raised in his right hand. Rourke fired twice, dropping him before he could throw it. Another soldier attempted to drag a light machine gun into position. Mallory spotted him and shot him before he could set up. The intensity continued to rise. Rourke's arms were shaking from strain, and his shoulder throbbed from repeated recoil, but the adrenaline forced him forward. He reloaded again and again. Each time the clip snapped into place, he gained another chance to hold the line for a few more seconds. At one point, Mallory crawled beside him, breathing heavily. "How's your ammo?" he asked. "Low," Rourke said. Mallory handed him a muddy bandolier. "Last one from the reserve. Make it count." Rourke slipped it over his shoulder and continued firing. The third wave finally began to scatter, pulling back toward the ridge. But instead of retreating fully, they regrouped behind a line of thick trees. Rourke wiped water from his eyes and scanned the clearing. The Marines were exhausted. Hale leaned forward, breathing hard. The bar gunner's hands were trembling. 2 Marines farther down the line were checking each other for shrapnel wounds. Rourke knew from the pattern that the next wave would be the strongest. The attackers had tested the line, adapted to its weaknesses, and now they were preparing for the decisive push. Rain hammered the ground. Steam rose from the mud. Every Marine braced themselves for what was coming. Rourke checked his rifle, secured the remaining clips, and steadied his breathing. He knew they had minutes, maybe seconds, before the next assault, and the outcome of the entire left flank now depended on how long they could continue to hold their ground. The fourth wave hit the Marines harder than any of the previous ones. There was no warning this time, no shouted orders from the tree line, no scattered rifle fire to announce the attack. The enemy simply emerged from the jungle in coordinated groups, advancing with determined speed, using every available piece of cover to reach the American line before their momentum could be stopped. It was clear they intended to break the flank completely with one overwhelming push. Rourke saw them closing the distance more aggressively than before. Some moved in pairs, using suppressive fire to shield the advance of soldiers carrying grenades. Others sprinted directly toward the gaps they had identified earlier. One group crawled through the mud, trying to get within throwing range. The rain did nothing to slow them. "Hold the line," Mallory shouted. His voice was hoarse from directing the squad through nearly half an hour of nonstop fighting. He repositioned 2 Marines who had drifted too far out of alignment. His movements were deliberate but slower than before. Fatigue was hitting everyone. Rourke lifted his rifle and fired into the nearest group. The recoil jolted his bruised shoulder again, but he kept a firm grip. When the clip emptied, his hands repeated the sequence he had practiced endlessly. Angle the rifle, insert the new clip, drive the bolt forward, raise the weapon, fire. His motions were so exact that even in the middle of the chaos, he did not lose a second. The Japanese force continued pressing forward. A soldier carrying a knee mortar paused behind a tree and fired a round that exploded near Hale's position. Hale hit the dirt as fragments tore through the vines above him. He quickly rolled to a new spot, chambered a round, and fired back at the mortar gunner before he could reload. On the far left, two Marines struggled to keep a small group of attackers from sweeping around the perimeter. Rourke shifted his aim and fired to relieve the pressure on them, dropping one of the flanking soldiers. Mallory shouted for the two Marines to tighten up their spacing and stay close to the fallen palm trunks. A grenade landed near the bar gunner. He shoved it away with the butt of his weapon before diving behind a stump. The explosion sent mud flying high into the air. The gunner scrambled back to his position and fired a burst into an advancing cluster of men. The bar barrel steamed, then hissed as rain continued to strike it. Rourke reloaded again, his hands coated in mud, but functioning with the same precision as before. Every motion was essential. Every second mattered. He fired into another advancing group, forcing them to drop into the mud. Hale fired beside him, working his bolt as quickly as his arms would allow. One attacker managed to get close enough to throw a grenade. It bounced once in the mud and rolled toward Mallory. Without hesitation, Mallory kicked it backward toward the tree line and pressed himself flat. The grenade detonated midair, sending debris across the clearing. Mallory rose again, coughing from the blast, and resumed shouting orders. Rourke noticed a sudden shift on the right side of the line. A group of Japanese soldiers had rushed through a low section of brush, entering a shallow dip in the terrain that gave them partial cover. If they crossed that dip and reach higher ground, they would be directly behind the flank. Rourke turned, firing rapidly to prevent the breakthrough. Hale adjusted his own fire to support him. The attackers backed off for a moment, but they soon regrouped. "More coming on your left," Hale warned, pointing through the rain. Rourke turned back just in time to see another group closing in, led by a soldier carrying a bayonet-fixed rifle. Rourke fired once, then again, then reloaded with a fast, controlled motion. The front soldier fell, slowing the group for a moment. That brief pause gave the Marines precious seconds. Despite the pressure, Rourke remained focused. He could feel his arms shaking from fatigue and the repeated recoil. His shoulder burned with each shot. Mud covered his uniform, face, and hands. His pouches were nearly empty, and the bandolier Mallory had given him earlier was now half used. Still, he kept firing. Mallory crawled to Rourke's position, bracing himself against the trunk. His voice was low but firm. "This is it. This wave is their big push. If we hold through this, they'll break." Rourke nodded, reloading again. "How long has it been?" "Too long," Mallory said, wiping mud from his eyes. "Radio finally got through. Reinforcements are pushing toward us, but they're stuck behind a washout. We're on our own until they find a way around." Rourke fired into the advancing line again, dropping two soldiers who had tried to close the distance. Hale fired next to him, cycling rounds as fast as he could. The bar gunner adjusted his position and laid down a burst that cut through a group attempting to move along the ridge. The attackers were now within 20 yards in some places. The rain made it difficult to distinguish individual shapes, and muzzle flashes lit up the clearing in brief flickers. Mud splashed with every impact. The sound was relentless. Rifles cracking, bar hammering, Mallory shouting, attackers yelling as they pushed forward. Rourke fired again. The clip ejected. His hands moved. His rifle rose. He fired. The pattern repeated until the motions blurred into one continuous cycle. He didn't think about the reload anymore. He only reacted to the targets in front of him. Finally, slowly, the formation of the attackers began to waver. Their movements lost coordination. The tight group scattered. The officers behind them shouted orders, but the men hesitated. The pressure had reached its limit. One by one, the Japanese soldiers began retreating into the treeline, pulling back behind roots and thick vegetation. The last few rifle shots faded into the distance. Mud and smoke settled across the clearing. Rourke kept his rifle raised, waiting for another push, but none came. The fourth wave had broken. Rourke lowered his rifle, chest heaving, soaked in sweat and rain. His hands shook violently from exhaustion. Hale leaned beside him, breathing hard. Mallory crouched nearby, watching the treeline without blinking. They had held the line again. But every man knew the next minutes would decide whether they survived the day or not. The moment the fourth wave collapsed, the clearing fell into a tense and uneasy quiet. No one relaxed. No one celebrated. Every Marine along the flank kept his rifle raised, waiting for another group of attackers to emerge through the sheets of rain. The sound of dripping water replaced the crack of gunfire, but the pressure on the men's nerves did not ease. They had been fighting for more than 30 minutes without a break, and their bodies were reaching their limits. Rourke wiped mud and rain from his face with the back of his sleeve. His hands shook uncontrollably, not from fear, but from the strain of constant firing and reloading. His shoulder felt swollen from the repeated recoil. The inside of his elbow trembled each time he lifted his rifle. His pouches were nearly empty. Only a few clips remained, each one coated in grime. Hale crawled closer and rested beside him. He was breathing heavily, his shoulders rising and falling in uneven rhythm. "I'm almost dry," Hale said, tapping the 2 rounds left in his magazine. "After this, I'm picking up whatever I can find." Rourke checked his equipment. 2 clips, maybe 3 if the mud hasn't ruined the last one. Mallory slid into position next to them, still scanning the treeline. His uniform was torn in several places, and blood from a shallow graze ran down his forearm, mixing with rainwater. He pressed a hand against his sleeve to slow the bleeding. "Listen carefully," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Command says reinforcements are coming, but they're still fighting through a flooded section of the trail. Might take 10 more minutes. Might take longer." Rourke nodded. Hale nodded as well, even though his expression made it clear he doubted any help would arrive in time. Mallory continued. "Enemy pushed hard on that last one. They wanted the flank. They still do. They're regrouping. When they come again, they'll come fast. They know we're low on ammo." The silence was briefly broken by movement on the right. 2 Marines dragged a wounded man toward a safer position behind a stump. A corpsman slid next to him, opening his field kit under the rain. The wounded Marine clutched at his stomach, trying to breathe. The corpsman's voice was low and calm, telling him to hold on. The bar gunner rejoined the line, his weapon slung over his shoulder for the moment. Steam still rose from the barrel. He sat down heavily and rubbed his eyes with shaking hands. "Barrel's close to burning out," he muttered. "If they come again, I'll fire short bursts only. That's all I can give." Everyone knew the truth. The squad was exhausted, low on ammunition, and injured. If another large attack came before reinforcements arrived, they would be overwhelmed. Rourke looked at the treeline. The rain had thinned into a steady drizzle. The fog rising from the ground made the jungle appear even more disorienting. He listened for anything: footsteps, voices, broken branches. The seconds dragged. Every muscle in his body remained tense. Hale whispered, "You think they're done?" Rourke shook his head. "No, they're waiting for the right moment." A minute passed, then 2. The jungle remained almost silent. Mallory checked his watch and pulled a fresh clip from his pouch. Only 1 left. "All right," he said quietly. "If they hit us again, we control fire. No wasted shots. Pick targets, stay low, and don't let them close." Rourke adjusted his grip. The rifle felt heavier now, as if soaked from days of rain instead of minutes. He tightened the sling to stabilize it. Then, faintly, movement flickered between the trees. Rourke raised his rifle immediately. Hale lifted his Springfield. Mallory leaned into his firing stance. A group of Japanese soldiers emerged on the left, only 10 or 12 at first. Then more shapes materialized behind them. The attackers were advancing again, but this wave moved differently, slower, more deliberate, more spread out. Their officers had changed tactics. Instead of rushing the line in tight groups, they were now advancing in small, staggered formations, using spacing to minimize the effectiveness of American fire. Rourke took aim. His breathing steadied. When the nearest soldier came into clear view, Rourke fired a single shot. Hale fired a second. The line of attackers continued to advance, stepping over the fallen without hesitation. Another shot, another reload. Rourke's hands did not fail him. The clip snapped into place with precision despite his exhaustion. He chambered the next round and fired again. The attackers fanned out to avoid creating clusters. They aimed carefully, firing controlled shots that forced the Marines to move between cover points. Mallory returned fire, adjusting slowly due to the wound on his arm. The bar gunner provided a short burst, just long enough to slow one group, then cooled his barrel. For the first time in the fight, Rourke noticed a tremor in his trigger finger. He tightened his grip and adjusted his breathing. The strain was building. His vision narrowed. His hands felt swollen from the friction of wet metal. A soldier on the far left threw a grenade. Rourke fired instinctively, hitting him before he completed the movement. The grenade fell harmlessly into the mud. Another group advanced through the center. Rourke turned and fired again, dropping two before reloading. Hale covered the rest with carefully aimed shots. The attackers fell back a few steps, reevaluating their approach. Then the pressure broke. The Japanese formation began to falter. Their officers shouted for them to press forward, but the men hesitated. Fatigue, casualties, and the unexpected resistance on the flank forced them to reconsider. Their advance slowed. Their fire became less coordinated. Then the first few soldiers retreated into the trees. Mallory saw it immediately. They're pulling back. Keep your rifles up. Don't move. The remaining soldiers hesitated a moment longer before disappearing into the ferns. The jungle swallowed them quickly, leaving only drifting smoke and the constant sound of rainfall. Rourke lowered his rifle slowly. His hands continued to shake, but the line had held again. Hale leaned back against the trunk, exhaling sharply. Mallory wiped more blood from his sleeve and looked toward the ridge. The attack had not broken them, but the fight had pushed them to the absolute limit. Only one question remained. How much longer could they endure if the enemy decided to come again? The final minutes of the fight arrived without warning. Rourke had just lowered his rifle to wipe the rain from his eyes when Hale stiffened beside him. Movement, Hale whispered. Left side. Rourke raised his weapon again, and Mallory signaled the rest of the squad to stay alert. The exhaustion was visible in all of them. Mud-covered uniforms, trembling hands, and shallow breathing. But no one hesitated. It was quiet at first. Then faint shapes shifted between the tree trunks. More figures emerged. Then more, forming a scattered but unmistakable pattern. The Japanese were preparing one last attempt to break through the flank. It was not a large wave, but the distance was short, the Marines were nearly out of ammunition, and the attackers appeared determined to finish what the earlier waves had started. Rourke braced himself behind the palm trunk. His hands felt stiff, and his shoulder throbbed each time he shifted position. Hale checked the bolt of his Springfield again, ensuring it moved cleanly despite the mud. Mallory crouched slightly, raising his rifle with his uninjured arm. The attackers advanced with a low, steady pace. There was no shouting this time, no dramatic charge, no scattered rush. They moved with controlled purpose, likely aware the Marines were worn down. A few carried rifles. Others had bayonets fixed. One man in the back held a light machine gun. The rain softened into a light drizzle, improving visibility just enough for the Marines to see the precise distances. The jungle smelled of wet earth, gunpowder, and smoke. Steam rose from the ground where the earlier firefights had disturbed the soil. Rourke waited until the front line of attackers reached 40 yards. Then he fired a single, controlled shot. Hale followed with another. The Japanese line reacted instantly, spreading out to avoid clustering. Two of them sprinted ahead, using fallen branches for cover. Others provided suppressive fire that forced the Marines to duck. Rourke reloaded with a practice motion, but his hands slipped slightly from the mud. He corrected quickly and fired again. He could feel his fingers weakening, but the rhythm of his reload carried him through the motions. Each shot was deliberate. Each target he engaged moved closer than the last. Hale chambered another round and fired at a soldier attempting to flank the far left. The man fell into the brush. The bar gunner, though exhausted, angled his weapon and delivered a short burst that forced a group to drop to the mud. He immediately pulled back to avoid fouling the barrel again. A sharp burst of fire struck the stump beside Mallory. Splinters flew across his face. He turned and fired a precise shot at the source. His wounded arm trembled afterward, but he held his stance. The attackers continued to push forward, now within 30 yards. Rourke fired again, hitting a soldier carrying a grenade. The grenade rolled harmlessly into a puddle and sank. Rourke reloaded, his fingers slipping on the clip before he forced them into steady movement again. Hale grunted as a bullet grazed his boot. He pulled his leg back and pressed himself tighter against the trunk. "They're closing in," he said through clenched teeth. Rourke didn't answer. He fired again, then again. The damaged palm trunk shook each time round struck it. Mud splashed onto his face and uniform. His ears rang from the constant noise. The recoil felt stronger each time he pulled the trigger. The attackers were now barely 20 yards away. Their formation began to break, not because of confusion, but because they were preparing to rush the line in small groups. One soldier darted forward, bayonet raised. Rourke fired at him, then reloaded with what felt like the last of his strength. Behind him, Mallory shouted, "Hold! They're almost done. Hold the flank." More Japanese soldiers hesitated as they approached the bodies of the men who had fallen earlier in the clearing. The hesitation slowed their advance, and Hale used the opportunity to fire 2 precise rounds that stopped another push. The bar gunner, breathing heavily, steadied his weapon against a stump and fired a short burst that forced the remaining attackers to take cover behind a cluster of ferns. For a moment, the enemy seemed unsure. They shifted positions, attempted to regroup, then hesitated again. Their officers shouted from the rear, urging them forward. But the sustained resistance from the Marines, exhausted, injured, and nearly out of ammunition, held them in place. Rourke reloaded again, feeling the last clip slip between his fingers. He steadied it, slammed it into the rifle, and closed the bolt. He aimed at the soldier carrying the light machine gun. One shot. The man fell sideways. The soldiers next to him paused, unsure whether to advance or retreat. That moment of uncertainty spread quickly. The line of attackers faltered. One soldier stepped back. Another followed. Within seconds, the remaining Japanese troops began withdrawing into the trees, first in small groups, then in a steady retreat that dissolved into the jungle. Rourke kept his rifle raised until the last figure disappeared. His hands shook violently. His arms felt numb. He exhaled slowly, lowering the weapon only when he was certain no one else was coming. Hale leaned against the trunk, chest rising and falling in deep, unsteady breaths. "That was the last of them," he said softly. Mallory scanned the tree line for several more seconds before finally lowering his rifle. His voice was steady but quiet. "We held. Reinforcements will be here any minute. You two did everything right." Rourke didn't speak. He stared at his hands, covered in mud, sweat, and powder residue. The reload motions he had practiced, the same motions other Marines had laughed at, were the reason he still had a weapon in his hands after nearly 40 minutes of nonstop fighting. Around them, Marines emerged slowly from behind cover, exhausted but alive. Some collapsed into the mud. Others leaned against trees. A few checked their rifles as if still unsure the fight was truly over. Rourke sat down with his back against the palm trunk. His legs trembled from fatigue. His breathing was uneven. Hale sat beside him, silent, equally drained. Mallory rested on one knee, his wounded arm shaking slightly as he pressed his hand against it. The rain continued to fall in a steady, calm rhythm. The flank had held. The perimeter had survived. And the 190 men behind them were safe because a handful of exhausted Marines refused to break under relentless pressure. For the first time since the battle began, Rourke allowed himself to close his eyes for a moment. Not to rest, but to process the reality that they were still alive.